Good afternoon, Stefan, and welcome to Talking to Thinkers.
Hi, Johnny. Nice to see you.
Great. Well, if we can start at the beginning of your life, Stefan, can you describe your childhood?
Well, I was born in 1947 in Surrey, county just south of London, and that's where I grew up. Um, at the time, it was on the edge of outer suburbia where that met the countryside. Now it's much more built up, but not a place of any very distinct regional character. My parents, my mother's family came from Kent and had been agricultural workers, and she worked in a shop before she got married. Um, my father's family was rather different. My great grandfather had come from that part of what is now northeastern Italy, the Dolomites, but which in the late 19th century, when he left, had been part of Austro-Hungary. So he was technically a subject of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy when he left, and then the family settled in London. Both my parents left school at 14, didn't have any more education than that, and came, I suppose, from working class backgrounds. And during my childhood, we would probably have been classified as a lower middle class family. My father had initially started to work with his father in a small tool grinding business. They sharpened tools for people like hairdressers and tailors and people who needed precision grinding. And my father did that for some years by himself. But then he made his hobby his work, and he took over a small derelict small holding market garden because he was an absolutely manic gardener. And so now he could do this as his occupation. And that was going quite successfully for a few years. But then when I was 14, my mother died. And my father, I think, rather lost heart on the whole enterprise. And so at that point, he sold that. And perhaps we'll come to later, moved away from where I grew up. So my childhood, as when I was a young child, was a very happy childhood in those circumstances. I was an only child, but there were friends and a lot of countryside to play in and all that kind of thing. Perhaps less happy as an adolescent, but who is happy as an adolescent? But that's when we get into things like school and so on.
Yes. So, well, maybe if we get into that, I mean, what sort of education did you have? Early education.
Well, I went to an ordinary local primary school. In those days, England, or that part of England, had the 11 plus system, exams, essentially intelligence tests at age 11 to determine if you were going to be part of the about 20 or 25% that would go on to a grammar school, which was the more academically ambitious kind of secondary schooling, or the 75% who would go to what were called the secondary modern schools, which were less academically ambitious. I have to say it's a system that I always opposed and been very critical of. I think it was extremely unfair to a large part of the population who were often left feeling that they had failed or been second best or whatever. But it served me as an individual exceptionally well. I seem always to have been, for better or worse, good at exams. And I did very well in this and got to go to a very good local grammar school of a grammar school of a slightly unusual kind. It was what was then called a direct grant grammar school. That is to say, it wasn't built and financed by the local education authority, but got its grant from the central government in London directly, which enabled it to retain a certain autonomy, in return for which it undertook to take a large number of pupils who had passed the 11 plus in the local education area. In this case, it was a Catholic grammar school. My father had been brought up as a Catholic. It had rather lapsed in him, and it never took in me, but he nonetheless was quite pleased that I got into this direct grant Catholic grammar school. And as I say, it served me enormously well. I was very happy there. For all the criticisms I might make of the system, those grammar schools provided not just an academically really quite stretching education, but a lot of cultural and sporting activities as well, a very rich diet of things. I was in the literary society and the debating club and the chess club, but I was also, as it happened, I was quite good at sports, and I was captain of the rugby team and played in the cricket team and all those kinds of things. So it was a very representative, I think, school experience of the 1960s at a good direct grant grammar school.
Mm-hmm. So you were a bit of an all-rounder then?
Well, I'd always liked sport and been good at sport by school standards. And I'm sure that enabled me to enjoy school much, much more than I would otherwise. Because if I'd just been a rather swotty, bookish boy, I expect I could have been quite unhappy at school. But as you know, at school, this was an all-boys school, as so many were then. At such schools, being good at sport always gave you a bit of, kind of standing. And so if you were good at school and you were good at sport, you got the best of both worlds.
Hmm. So you obviously did well at school, as you said, you were good at exams. So was there an expectation then you would go to university by your father or yourself or the school?
Well, of course, it hadn't been part of my parents' lives or horizons really at all. And it was the school that was ambitious in this direction. It was trying to, I suppose, in a way, improve its status, and it wanted to get some boys into Oxford and Cambridge, and it devised an accelerated scheme. We did our exams a year early so that we could stay on at school to do the Oxford or Cambridge entrance. I think a fortunate thing for me was that although this was not something my father was at all familiar with, he was willing to support my going on to the next stage of education, in part because when he remarried, my stepmother, with whom I got on very well, had already two grown-up sons, and one of them had gone to university. So I think that the sense that that was a possible thing to do had become more concrete, as it were, for my father by that point. And of course, we have to remember this was the almost immediately post-Robbins era. Expansion of university places was very much in the news, and I suspect there were, I can't remember, but I suspect there were other boys in the neighbourhood or sons of people he knew who were also starting to go this route as more and more people went to university. So I was in that sense very, very lucky, and to his great credit, although it wasn't part of his world, he encouraged me to go ahead.
And what brought you to Cambridge, Stefan?
Well, I mean, I didn't know anything about these places. And I can remember my headmaster telling me that I should go to Cambridge and saying to me, which college do you want to go to? And I didn't know there were colleges. And I vividly remember that he looked me up and down trying to think what he could know about me, and then revealed it by saying, well, I think, Collini, you should go to Jesus College because they have the playing fields on the site. It's true, Jesus is the only college with the playing fields inside the college walls, as it were. So they put me in for that. And at the time, I was very, very undecided whether to apply to do history or English. These were my two great loves at school, and I was more or less equally attracted by them. Just at the last moment, because you had to put something on the form, I put history rather than English. And so then I got a scholarship in history to go to Cambridge in 1966.
So 1966, how did you find Cambridge when you arrived there, socially?
Yes, I mean, I noticed that quite a lot of people in writing their reminiscences of going to Cambridge from, I suppose, what is now called a less advantaged social background, often report how difficult they found it or how alien and so on, not part of their world. I honestly don't think that was my experience. It seemed to me a delightful place. There were lots of people like me there to play with and talk to and drink with, and you could play sports, and there were books to be read and interesting lectures and so on to go to, beautiful buildings. And I don't think, for whatever reason, whether it was my own insensitivity or not, but I don't think the question of the social class of the young men, again, the college was still all male in those days, really intruded. I mean, to this day, I'm not sure I know what kind of school most of my college friends went to. It wasn't a very prominent issue somehow for us. Whether that was because by the mid-60s, there was such a large number of people from grammar schools going, and it ceased to be very remarkable, or whether, as I say, because I wasn't at that point politically engaged or even awakened, I think. I was too busy doing the other things that you do when you're 19. And so I actually found Cambridge as an undergraduate very agreeable. Later, just skipping ahead a little bit, I was elected to a research fellowship at St John's College. These are meant to be postdoctoral fellowships. I think they mostly are now, but when I got mine, I hadn't finished my PhD. And that catapulted you into the level of being a fellow of a college and so on. And that I found I didn't care for very much. It was too masculine and too complacent, I felt. I suppose I was an impatient young man, and the high table way of life didn't appeal to me. So Cambridge, in that sense, by later in my mid-20s, I think, came to seem not alien, but something I found about it that was rather unsympathetic. But as an undergraduate, I enjoyed it enormously.
Hmm. And you said it was a close tie between history or English literature. When you ended up doing history at Jesus College, did you find that intellectually rewarding, or did you have any regrets? Oh, I should have taken English.
I don't think I had any regrets. I mean, every so often I would fantasize about what it had been like if I had done English, and probably the rest of my career shows that I've been wobbling on one side or other of that border line ever since. No, I quite quickly found that I was interested in those aspects of the history syllabus that enabled you to study texts and ideas more than, say, the mainstream political or economic history. So the Cambridge undergraduate degree, when I did it in the late 60s, had 2 papers on the history of political thought in it, one from Plato to the mid-18th century and one from the mid-18th century onwards. And I found those very interesting because you could read these famous books and spend time arguing about them and so on. So that attracted me. And then I was very lucky in the final year in Cambridge, I think it's probably still true, history students do what's called a special subject, where you are supposed to work entirely from original documents, quite a narrowly circumscribed topic, number of topics prescribed for the year. And the year that I was doing it, one of the topics, the one I chose, was called Darwin and Public Debate, 1830 to 1870. And so, as you can see already, that the possibility of doing a kind of intellectual history and looking at public debate, the Victorian periodicals and so on, reception of Darwin's ideas, all that kind of thing. I enjoyed that very much. So I probably went a little light on the mainstream aspects of history and instead concentrated on, I'm not even sure at the time I knew to call it intellectual history, but I concentrated on what I can see really were the intellectual history offerings in the course.
And were there any particular tutors or teachers there that had a big impact on you, especially in that area of intellectual history?
This is always a slightly embarrassing question for me. I've been asked this before, and the embarrassment is that I can too easily sound as though I was entirely self-directed and self-made and so on, which is very far from the case. I owed a lot to all kinds of people. But there wasn't a single individual who taught me or inspired me at that point, I have to say. I mean, I had perfectly good teachers and teachers I got on with and thought well of, but they weren't particularly inspiring. I went to some quite famous sets of lectures. I mean, there was a figure called Duncan Forbes, who was then the main lecturer in the history of modern political thought, and who gave, I think, a rather celebrated course on Hegel and Marx, which I went to with rapt attention, but I was never taught by him. In a more minor way, excuse me, just as an example of the riches on offer, I had chosen in my first year to do the paper on ancient history, although I didn't have Greek and only O-level Latin, but you didn't need it. And so I went to a set of lectures by Moses Finley, and they were on ancient economic history. And to me, they were absolutely fascinating because here was a obviously extremely clever historian trying to do economic history for a period and society where you don't have the normal records from which you do economic history. You had to piece it together from very small fragments of literary and archaeological evidence and so on. And so just seeing this man standing at the front, as it were, piecing together a story was, I think, for me, probably quite a good example of some of the power of history, of historical imagination, historical methodology, even though I never went on to do anything more in ancient history and wasn't a pupil of Finlay's.
That's interesting. I mean, this sounds like you had a lot of freedom to pursue your own interests, which I'm not sure if that's as much there today as it may be in your time.
Yes. Well, I think there wasn't a very wide range of choice as far as the courses went. I mean, I've mentioned the ones that I chose to do. I did also have to do ones that appealed to me a bit less. You know, I had to do my medieval European history and Tudors and Stuarts and those kinds of things. The numbers were quite small, but as I say, I was lucky that there were enough that really caught my imagination, and in particular in that special subject on Darwin and public debate, since the special subject courses changed quite frequently depending on who'd put on some special option. I think I was lucky in that way. I think it's still true, really, that attendance at lectures is a very variable activity. There's no question of attendance being taken or anything like that. There were a lot of lectures put on, and you were encouraged by your director of studies to go to this one or that one if you were taking that particular paper. But beyond that, you could shop around a bit. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the wrong impression. I was not the most diligent undergraduate. I don't think I had really yet quite settled on what I wanted to do. I was having too good a time in other ways quite often. But I was lucky. I was in a university which had some really outstanding people lecturing, and you know, when I had managed to get out of bed and go to the lectures, I really found them rewarding.
I mean, my next set of questions are maybe you can clarify a bit, because in your CV you did a BA and a PhD in Cambridge, and you also are noted of doing a master's in Yale. So maybe if you can, I'm not sure what the sequencing was there. So you obviously did your BA first, but did you go to Yale and then come back to Cambridge, or did you do your PhD and then go to Yale? How did that work out? And what was the background to those decisions?
Yes. Well, the background, I think in almost literal sense, the background to the decisions was 1968, in the sense that, you know, for every red-blooded young Englishman, go west young man seemed to be the thing. Somehow it was all happening in America, and we all thought that was the place to go. I didn't really know what I was doing, but when I was in my final year as an undergraduate in Cambridge, I applied to several American universities to be a graduate student, and Yale was one of them. I didn't know that much more about it than that, really. But those were very rich days, and it offered me a full 4-year graduate fellowship to do a PhD there. So immediately after I graduated from Cambridge, I went to Yale the next year, 69, 70. which was a very interesting and enjoyable year in lots of ways. I, of course, had done more history as an English undergraduate than my American contemporaries had. They'd had a broader education, but American graduate education was so much better organized, I think, than British graduate education at that point. British graduate education, if you call that, that's the word, mainly involved giving you a library card and saying, come back in 3 or 4 years' time with a thesis. Whereas, of course, there was coursework in the States, and I did the first year of that. But by then, at the end of that, I had met a woman I wanted to be with, and she had applied to be a graduate student in Yale and in Cambridge in England, and she got a scholarship to Cambridge and not to Yale. And since I'd, in my final year at Cambridge, got a first, I had the option of having a grant to be a graduate student in Cambridge again. So I, in fact, slightly with misgivings, threw up the Yale appointment I had, because I could have had another 3 paid 4 years there, and came back to Cambridge and did my PhD in Cambridge. But the year in New Haven was instructive for me in lots of ways. I mean, I came from as I said, a relatively unremarkable English suburban background. And it was a time of tremendous political ferment in the States, of course. I mean, I even got, as proud memento, I even got mildly gassed by the National Guard as they were clearing an anti-Vietnam demonstration on the Green in New Haven. And it was the year of the Black Panther trials and so on, and tremendously heightened racial tension in New Haven, which were things, beyond my ken when I was growing up. And so in some of those ways, spending the year in the States was really tremendously educative.
I mean, instinctively, were you sympathetic to the spirit of the 1960s, or did you find it, or were you more sympathetic to a more conservative approach? No.
I was very much, in tune in that sense. I mean, the very choice to go there, I think, had been part of that. The fact of the kinds of television programs I like, political satire, things to do with contemporary rock music, and so on. I was a representative or unremarkable, I think, student age person in 1968, 1970. I was not very politically aware. I mean, as I say, these American experiences opened my eyes to some things, but even then, I think it was some time before I really developed a kind of sustained commitment in political terms. But in terms broader cultural affiliation, I was a child of the 60s.
And did you share the optimism of that age then?
I think at that point, I and many of my friends, we were so blithe about matters. I think we didn't really focus on or anticipate the difficulties. I think true in our own lives, we'd set off and do something without really reckoning how difficult it was going to be, what the consequences would be if it went wrong. We didn't, like so much of my generation, we didn't particularly worry about being employed after being a student. We somehow thought that would all look after itself, I suppose. And so I suspect without being very clear in my mind or the minds of my friends about what sort of improvements the political future might hold, I suspect we were broadly just confident that the world was in some ways getting better and was certainly going to treat us quite well. So to that extent, I think I was rather unreflectively optimistic.
So you returned to Cambridge and you do your PhD there. Do you recall what you did your PhD on?
Well, do I ever? Yes. I mean, this is where the rather laissez-faire English system didn't serve me well to begin with, because I had no idea what a PhD was. I didn't understand about the degree of specialization it involved, really. And I didn't have any very clear idea about a topic. I remember my very first proposal was, I can't, of course, keep a straight face even now by saying it. My first proposal was the relations of history and literature.
Very modest.
Very modest indeed. And I was assigned to this very nice and genial older man to be my supervisor. And I would explain that this was my project, and he would say, "Well, that sounds very interesting. If you have any trouble, do get in touch." And of course, even I could see after a while that this wasn't quite the thing. So I came up with something else. I remember at one point I'd come up with some idea of a new history of philosophy, equally modest. And of course, he again, said, "Well, that sounds very interesting. If you have any trouble, get in touch." So I completely wasted my first year casting around in this way. But eventually I got interested in I think in a partly theoretical way, the problem of the relations of liberalism and sociology, as it were, the obvious individualism of traditional liberalism, the obvious emphasis on the collective and society of sociology, and the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, these had come together in the new liberalism, and particularly in the work of this figure, L.T. Hobhouse, who'd been the first professor of sociology in Britain, but also the leading new liberal theorist. That engaged my interest a lot, and that became a topic, and I started to work on that in some detail, and that's eventually what I wrote my PhD about.
And eventually that got published as a book.
Yes, that's my first book, Liberalism and Sociology, which came out in 1979.
Well, you mentioned that you won a fellowship to St. John's, but at some point then you got your friction kicked in with Cambridge, or some sort of misgivings, and then you end up going to Sussex, the University of Sussex. So maybe if you could just explain a little bit more about the background of that decision. Was it just you want to get out of Cambridge, or that Sussex really tempted you positively?
It was a bit of both. I had about 3 years still to run on my fellowship. It was very early days when this Sussex job came up, and I didn't necessarily think I should apply for a job yet, because I had 3 years of paid idleness to enjoy. But wiser heads, my friends and advisors, said, "No, look, this is the only job in the country in intellectual history." The job was actually advertised as a lectureship in intellectual history, which nowhere else had at the time, and that Sussex is the place. These are your interests. You really should apply. And they were right, of course, and I did apply, and I was lucky I got it. I was, I think, at that point pleased to leave that, what I call that side of high table Cambridge, that I didn't really much like. And I was very pleased to go to Sussex. I mean, Sussex, probably hard for people now to reconstruct, but in the 1960s and 1970s, Sussex had a tremendous reputation as the new coming place. Undergraduates were even choosing to go there in some cases rather than Oxford or Cambridge. It attracted very, excuse me, very interesting teaching staff. And it, of course, didn't have traditional departments and single honours degrees, single subject degrees. It deliberately had an interdisciplinary structure and teaching syllabus. And intellectual history was one part of that in its own name. And then quite a lot of the courses which students took, which were across the board, as it were in fact courses in the history of ideas, and one heading or another. So I found it initially tremendously heady and exciting place to be. Unfortunately, I think Sussex then fell on hard times. The cuts to British universities didn't serve it well. It didn't have a lot to kind of fall back on, and it's become a more, in some ways, more conventional university, abandoned some of those early ideas, and has struggled a bit, I think, in recent years. But at that point, it really was a very, very alive and attractive place.
I mean, when you were doing your intellectual history, it tends to be multidisciplinary. because you have to go into a bit of philosophy, as you say, sociology with Hobhouse, history, but it's not just one pure subject. And then you say you go to Sussex, which at the time was famous for its interdisciplinary approach. So did you see Sussex as a kind of an extension and maintenance of what you were doing, or did you find, oh no, this is another level into interdisciplinary studies that I really have to get a handle on here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and to be absolutely honest, I'm not sure I remember well enough what I felt in 1974 when I first went there. Certainly, I had to educate myself very fast in a lot of things, although that's probably true of most people when they get their first teaching job. I think what happened, not perhaps in the first year or two, but after I'd been there a while, was that the type of course that Sussex specialized in enabled me to combine literary and discursive or theoretical texts in my teaching. And that, in a way, was what I'd always, I can't even say subliminally, but I mean, I kind of half wanted to do, just as I'd half wanted to do English when I was going to university in the first place. So that aspect of it suited me very well. I mean, there was, for example, a course that every student in the School of European Studies took, modestly called the Modern European Mind. A lot of us taught for it. It was a big team taught course. But that was a course that involved looking at really the masterpieces of modernism in both thought and literature and art from the late 19th and into the mid 20th century. So you could do Freud, but you could do Virginia Woolf, you could do Nietzsche, but you could do Thomas Mann. And so that range of things really, I think, enabled me to express the interest that I had, but which had been a bit in the background when I'd had to concentrate on political and social thought when doing my PhD. And coming out of the Cambridge history tripos, but which now Sussex gave me more room to pursue as part of my actual teaching.
Who are the big names there when you were there, or who was really finding their feet when you were there as well, in this kind of in this multidisciplinary approach to history and political thought?
Well, the people I became closest to as friends and colleagues were John Burrow and Donald Winch. John Burrow, in fact, had a background intellectually very like mine. He'd done the history of political thought options in the Cambridge history tripos, but had always had an interest in intellectual history, and his first book had been in that direction. So our background was very similar. And I think, I mean, when you asked me earlier about people who had been influential teachers or models, I didn't have a very satisfactory answer. I think when I met John, although it was now later in my life, I was a young academic, I think I immediately felt that this was an affinity of a very deep kind, temperamentally and intellectually, more than with anybody who'd actually taught me. So although he was 12 years older than me, it became a very close intellectual association. And Donald Winch had, I mean, you were saying that intellectual historians, of course, combine work from more than one field. And Donald is a very good example because he'd begun academic life as an economist and then worked on the history of economic thought and then broadened out from that into more general history of ideas. And he also became a very close friend, and he was institutionally very active and strong figure, and he oversaw a course for all social scientists in their final year, where they had to do some philosophical work in the theory of social science and some historical work. And he and John had devised, before I got there, a very ambitious course in the history of the social sciences, trying to get away from the very present-minded kind of teleological story of the formation of disciplines, and instead to try and recover some of the original historical character of these earlier ideas that later people had taken up. And I was immediately recruited to teach for that as well. And so that extended my range a good deal. So those two in that area were both locally very significant figures, and for me personally, very, very important. There were a lot of other very impressive people around whom I as a rather junior figure, was a little bit shy of. People in English like Tony Nuttall, very distinguished scholar, in comparative literature like Tony Thorby or Gabriel Jospovici. These had all been really very, very significant, well, were being very significant figures in their field, and often taught as part of one of the groups. As I say, several of these large courses were taught by a group of teachers, and I would be one of the little junior underlings teaching it, and they would be the big names in it. But they were very encouraging and very positive figures to be around.
Well, actually, we just go back to the work you ended up doing with Winch and Burroughs, with the book, The Noble Science of Politics. I mean, that's quite a seminal work. And one of the things you just mentioned there about, one of the things you want to do is almost defamiliarize what had become a discipline, and go back to history and say, well, what was actually taught by these people at the time about politics, especially in Victorian England. And you produced this book that you wrote with Winch and Burroughs. So one of the questions that struck me when I read that book was, to what extent was there a self-conscious methodology going on here? And was it shared amongst the three of you? And my second question would be, did this have overlap with what people like Donne and Skinner and Pocock were doing in the 60s and 70s in Cambridge?
Yeah, okay. Well, of course, there are several elements to that. Well, I think one thing I would want to say first is, again, perhaps going back to that question you asked me about people who'd been in some way inspiring teachers or whatever. I was never taught by Quentin Skinner, but when I was a graduate student, I got to know him as a friend of friends. He was a young academic then, and I was a PhD student. And of course, when you're at that stage, having anybody take any serious interest in what you're doing is terribly valuable. And Quentin was really encouraging. He's very good at being encouraging and being interested in other people's work. And I was very grateful for that. And I think I've always tried to record that. At the time, he was writing his sequence of methodological essays that became so famous. And I recognized, I think, in those, I didn't operate at that level of theory at all myself, but I recognized in those, I think, a theorizing of something which in a more obscure or intuitive way I felt was the right way to do trade. So to that extent, I think I felt some broad sympathy with, I suppose, what's now become called the Cambridge School. I don't think it was at the time. It was just what Quentin and John Donne and John Pocock did, although I didn't share in it myself. I think when John Burrow and Donald Winch and I were writing our book together, that wasn't our frame of reference. We were confronting really the present-mindedness of the social sciences in their relation to their history, and trying, as you say, to kind of wrestle the history back, the real historicity of these past ideas back from this present-minded grip. And we were interested in a range of the forms of expression of past political concerns. And so to that extent, it was less a history of it wasn't a history of political theory it wasn't only that it was the social science side of it, but it was also not really theory. We were quite interested in a range of forms of writing, more occasional writing, essays, other bits of discursive writing. And so to that extent, I think we were not so close to the form of what you might call rational reconstruction of theory, which Quentin and John Donne and people particularly specialized in. So I don't think we had a kind of rival methodology. I just think we were animated by some other kinds of revisionist concerns and an interest in a really very wide range of types of writing. And that took us further and further away from history of political thought.
Okay. I mean, there's something kind of sui generis about that book, if you like. It's got I mean, I think this is one of the criticisms that also have, but you could also say it's one of the virtues. There's a sort of a fragmentary aspect to it. You don't have that kind of nice, smooth narrative. It's a series of chapters and more discontinuities than continuities, and an emphasis on the peculiarity of this genre, as opposed to it being a presage to something that came next.
Yeah, I mean, I think the characterization is right, and I can see why some people did think it was a weakness. It was deliberate. We wanted to accentuate the quiddity and distinctiveness of these various forms of writing and various figures in the past, and to show how this concern with things political got expressed in ways which weren't straightforwardly political theory or proto-social science. So we didn't aspire to be developing a kind of single connected narrative. They were chosen to be more a range of illustrative studies, the ones we thought were in many ways the most important or the most illuminating, but a series nonetheless. I don't think insofar as it has any kind of fragmentary or episodic character, I don't think that's to do with the fact that there were three of us writing and the way we composed it. I mean, the chapters were written in different ways, some closely collaborative, some more by one person and then revised by others and so on. But in some ways, the tone or voice of the book is more continuous than the subject matter is. I mean, I think it's not visibly a book by three different types of writers. It's couched in a single kind of register, but about a range of different types of subject. And we were not, I think, too cast down by the fact that some people thought it was a bit fragmentary or deliberately a little bit, obtuse. It was kind of seemed to be missing. People want to say, well, why isn't there a survey of utilitarianism or idealism or something like this? That surely was the dominant feature of 19th century political thought. And well, we thought, well, if that's what you want, go to a different kind of book. We're obviously not trying to do that. The book had a lot of attention, but you're right, not all of it was positive.
Well, actually, just before we leave that book, because we did touch on that, how did you pull that off? I mean, three different people writing a book like that, and that you almost have this single authorial voice?
Well, I think the fact that we were close friends to begin with was crucial. We spent a lot of time together talking about it. Quite a lot of alcohol was consumed at all these meetings. We set out on the project because I think we so very much saw eye to eye on the intellectual issues involved. I mean, obviously there is a spread of expertise there. I mean, the early chapters on the late 18th, early 19th century could only have been drafted initially by Donald, really, because he was the only one with enough knowledge of that. And you can see some of that sort of thing with some of the later chapters for John or for myself. But the actual writing and rewriting, and there was quite a lot of rewriting and drafting together, it was very enjoyable. It was largely very harmonious, except when John refused to do his footnotes properly. But apart from that, and I think just the fact that we we shared a conception of the kind of book we wanted it to be, meant that we were all, as it were, equally committed to it in that way. It wasn't that we were three people coming at it with some private little book of our own, which we were compromising on to write a book together. The commonality of the idea and the effort, I think, was what came first. And so that is really what, if anything, holds the book together. That's what holds it together.
Okay, well, thanks for explaining that. I mean, just to go back, maybe change the focus a little bit in the 70s, because you mentioned there about presentism, but one of the big, defining developments of the 1970s, from a political theory point of view, was the publication of John Rawls's Theory of Justice, followed by Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, and then a series, almost a cottage industry around both books, but more generally, the rebirth of normative political theory. Now, I know there's question marks that this was anticipated by other writers, but you were in this area of political theory, intellectual history, history of political thought. Did that impinge on you much, and if it did, what did you make of this rebirth?
No, I think this is where the label political thought might be a bit misleading or too broad, because in practice I wasn't in this area. I mean, of course, I was aware of Rawls and the discussion around Rawls and Nozick, but I wasn't someone who followed analytical or normative political theory at all. I didn't think political theory was my neck of the woods. I was already feeling that the history of political thought was too narrow or anyway, not the right identity for what I wanted to do. So I'd moved more into the history of social and cultural thought already. So I think my answer is going to be a bit disappointing to you, Johnny, because I really just didn't sufficiently engage with, or didn't, the whole impact of that revival of normative political theory led by Rawls didn't really impinge on me very directly at all. And by the time, there was such a flurry, or more than flurry, such a flourishing body of such work following in the 70s and 80s and 90s, my interests have gone even further away from it. So I haven't, I had no way kept up with the debate about it. So no, short answer is no. I was somewhere else at the time, Milad.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, one of the reasons it wasn't completely random, because one of your early essays you wrote for the Times Literary Supplement was a kind of a review of contemporary political theory or where it was going, and it was extremely perceptive. So even if you hadn't really gone deep into it, you had formed, a series of observations which I thought were quite acute and quite prescient about its shortcomings, its ahistorical nature, and so on, and how serious is normative political theory in terms of its connection with real world politics. And you made some, I thought, quite telling observations about in your review. But anyway, let's move on, because I think
I think that probably just shows that an overconfident, very young reviewer is willing to chance his arm on lots of things which he's not really entitled to do.
Okay, well, it didn't come across that way. It came across as very wise,
okay.
And maybe ahead of your years. But so anyway, you as we go into the 1980s, you return to Cambridge. You return to Cambridge in 1986, I believe. And interestingly, you don't end up going to the history department, or what was known as SBS, Social and Political School of Social and Political Science. You end up going into the Department of English. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then how that kind of in some way reflected where you were going intellectually.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, a couple of things I've said already. There's the long-running identity crisis of whether I'm more interested in literary and cultural things or in intellectual history. That had always been there. When I was teaching at Sussex, as I've said, I was teaching by the end as many literary as non-literary texts in the courses that I was teaching. I'd already been commissioned to do the volume on Matthew Arnold for the Oxford Past Masters series, which was a very congenial commission. I mean, partly the material that I could write about, but also writing in that format. So that he was normally regarded as a essentially literary figure in the way that people get assigned to these pigeonholes. And actually also in my other work in the 80s, I'd been starting writing about character and other cultural ideals of that sort in the 19th, early 20th century. So, I wasn't so far away from having already a set of interests that belonged as much in an English department as in an intellectual history outfit. And then Cambridge advertised this job. I can remember that it was very unusually phrased as something like a lecturer in English with a special interest in the history of ideas. And that seemed very appealing to me. And Cambridge had long had in the English faculty some established courses, one in particular which had been called, time immemorial, the English Moralists, which was a course in forms of ethical reflection and cultural criticism, again, by authors, some of whom would immediately be classed as literary, Carlyle or Ruskin, some of whom might not. And of course, in the end, were not always English either. People I enjoyed teaching, like Nietzsche and so on, and a long-running course on the history of criticism. So I immediately, when I was appointed to the job, I took over the main teaching for those two courses, which were my sort of thing. And I think I was just tremendously lucky. It was just as going to Sussex when I went there was a very good thing for me. It was a good time for it to happen. Moving to an English faculty, especially the Cambridge English faculty, at that point also suited me very well, enabled me to get on with the kinds of things that I wanted to do in a way in which, I mean, it's hard to tell, it's a rather vague counterfactual, but if I had got a job in a history department, I wonder if it would have been as tolerant of my, rather eclectic, or as they might have thought, fluffy interests, as, on the other hand, an English department was of my more historical interests. Possibly the Cambridge English faculty, which was a very pluralist institution at that point, was just a more hospitable home for doing those kinds of things. Anyway, I certainly found it to be a very congenial berth, and I'm sure there were quite a few people when I was appointed thought, who the hell is this? He's never done a degree in English in his life. But after a while, you stick around, you become part of the furniture. I was for years, decades, the convener of the criticism subject group. I eventually became chair of the faculty. It felt very, very much like home from quite early on. I was very happy there, and I think it enabled the direction that my interests were going at that point.
Well, when you described the advertisement for the role, it sounded like they wanted you.
No. I mean, nothing so flattering. I've never heard of me, I don't think. In fact, I believe that, I mean, of course, you never know this about appointments. I believe there was an internal candidate who was assumed was going to get it. No, I don't think so. I think it was that they realized that with one or two retirements and departures, these areas that I've mentioned, the moralists and the history of criticism and things like that, were rather underprovided for. So they wanted to accentuate that element. There were other jobs which, of course, accentuated Renaissance poetry or Victorian novel or something like that. But this was a more general description of something they thought they wanted. I just, again, I was lucky, the right place at the right time.
I mean, quite briefly, if you may, like, who are the main luminaries in the English department then at Cambridge when you went up there? It's had some great people there over the years. Yes.
Well, some of the best known people had recently retired. I mean, Frank Kermode, whom I later got to know very well, but he had left just before I came. People often think, because of my interests and the fact that I was at the same college, that I must in some way have known or worked with Raymond Williams, but I never did. I never met him. I never met him when I was an undergraduate, and he had retired from the faculty before I took up my job in Cambridge. So he had gone, and in fact, then he died within a year or two. So when I arrived, there was something of a new guard in the senior professorial positions. All women at one point. I was very lucky, I think, that the Regius Professor was Marilyn Butler, somebody I found very, very likable, and she and I ran a seminar together, and I became very fond of her, but also someone, as you probably know, with very strong historical interests. And so we overlapped there. Gillian Beer in 19th and 20th century literature was probably one of the best known local critics, and again, somebody whom I worked with quite a bit. So it had changed, but there was no shortage of interesting people and indeed powerful personalities around the place.
Well, I mean, it also seems to also, I mean, even though there was this, as you said, there was always this kind of, not oscillation, but you were moving, your interests were English literature and history, intellectual history, and probably philosophy as well, to a degree. But in the 1990s, we see a really explicit broadening in terms of your publication. And you mentioned the book on Arnold, but then you have this book these essays that were written on eco, Umberto Eco, interpretation over interpretation, which to me was a real marker that you're now getting into literature and semiotics or literary theory. I mean, this probably wasn't a sudden development for you, was it, or was this a gradual development that just sort of culminated in this book you did with two other writers?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have to be two parts to the answer to that, because on the one hand, the broadening of interest you mentioned, moving towards these more literary and cultural topics, did have quite a long history. I mentioned earlier that in the 80s, I'd started working on character, ideas of character, and I did get very interested in the sorts of broader cultural or ethical assumptions underlying some of the more explicit political convictions. And the book that I published in 1991, Public Moralists, had discussions of this, not arranged around individuals, but thematically around altruism, character, manliness, topics like this, which often had as much, as it were, literary material in them as more traditional theoretical material. So that, in that sense, my interests were moving in that direction, and I was teaching the introduction to criticism sort of material in Cambridge as well. So it was already going in that direction. You touch on something that is a bit embarrassing for me, I have to say, about the edited volume of Umberto Eco's lectures, because I don't know about you, I think we mostly, I mean, we could imagine doing things we'd done when we were younger better, but I don't think we particularly regret doing things. But I think the Eco volume is probably the only one that I do feel some misgiving about. The story is that Eco came to Cambridge to give the Tanner lectures at Clare Hall, where I was a fellow. And as the fellow in literature, I was asked to be his host and his minder. And that was great fun, because Eco himself was great fun, larger than life personality. And we had a very good time while he was in Cambridge. The lectures and the seminars we set up around them were very successful. At least drew very large audiences. And so the college and Cambridge University Press were very keen to make a book out of this. And I was, you know, in effect, press ganged as the person who would have to edit it, because I'd been the host fellow for the lectures. I didn't feel this really was my area. And I've never, I have to say, I've never reread the book. But I've always felt slightly embarrassed at having done it as someone who I mean, although I got, I followed the lectures closely, I was very interested in very good responses by, in particular, Richard Rorty and Jonathan Culler. But they were not my expertise. They were not in general a field I was, or subfield that I was deeply familiar with. So I felt a little bit more than the usual degree of fraudulence in having to frame all this and write the introduction and so on. And of course, the irony is that, I mean, nothing to do with me, but because of Eco's name, of course, it's the most widely translated thing I've ever done. I mean, I've lost count. It's been translated, that volume, into 15 or 20 or 25 languages, and so much of Echo must have been, I think, on the back of the Name of the Rose. So lots of people who've ever encountered my name encountered it as the editor of a book, which I wish I'd never really had to do. So that particular book, I think, is not a very good example of the movement of my interests. But you're absolutely right in your general point. By the 90s, they'd moved much more in that direction, and a lot of the subsequent writing was more of that kind.
Okay, well, very good. I'm glad you corrected the record there. For me, if not for anyone else. Something that really does become, I think, uncontroversially the case in your work from this period on, especially as you move into the 21st century, is that the essay comes to the forefront of it becomes your métier. So if we maybe kick off with, what is it about the essay form that appeals to you most?
Well, just to be autobiographical for a moment, when I was a late teenager, at the age when most red-blooded boys are reading about matters of life and death and Dostoevsky and so on, I had a developed taste for some reason for essays by Edwardian bookmen and 20th century authors. There was something already then about the way that the rather fragile little craft of an essay was kept afloat by the author's voice and personality, even when there wasn't a very strong argument or something like that. So I think I always had an interest in that as what was often called in the form of occasional writing. And then, of course, I'd become very interested from quite early on in forms of public debate and public discourse, and much of what is written in that form is written in essay form. If you're trying to reconstruct the history of, say, Victorian public debates or 20th century English literary cultures debates, a lot of it's going to be looking at essays. And so the form itself really did become central to what I worked on. And I suppose I have to say, since your questions stir kind of autobiographical reflections, I suppose I was drawn to writing them as well. I found something about at their best, the combination of the relative economy with the fairly relaxed discursiveness that an essay permits you, in a way in which a very tightly argued theoretical article doesn't, or a very heavily footnoted monograph doesn't in another direction. The essay has a bit more freedom in it, and depends more on the writerly craft that keeps it going than on the machinery, as it were. So I suppose for all those reasons, both as a subject matter and in a much smaller way as a practitioner, it really did become very central to what I did.
I mean, do you have models of great essayists that obviously you're not going to blindly follow them, but that you feel, that they definitely were masters of the art, and you can definitely learn from them, even obliquely?
Well, as you say, they're not exactly models, because it's always another time and another subject matter, and you're another person. I mean, I think some of the strengths of the essay for critical purposes are shown by some of the most obvious big names. In Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot, for example, and very different kinds of essayists, but Arnold's ways of trying to charm and tease his Victorian readers, Eliot's much spikier, but rather dazzlingly brilliant early critical essays, I think are well, if I don't know whether models is the word, but are very good exemplars of that genre. And in our own time, I mean, I mentioned somebody I came to like as well as admire. I think Frank Kermode, as a literary essayist, had a very sure touch for illuminating a writer or a literary topic and bringing the reader with him, not hectoring the reader or not getting the reader left behind in abstractions, but making it a kind of conversible journey. And so I think something about the features of all of people like that seem to me essays at their best.
I mean, one of the things that looks also very appealing about being good at essay writers, you're going beyond, you're going to reach an audience beyond the typical academic monograph. For a number of reasons, partly to do with the media in which they're published. They tend to get published in the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books, the TLS, so it's a wider readership by definition than a monograph that will sit in a library somewhere and may or may not be picked up by a student. But also then you mentioned this, that also imposes an obligation on the writer to be accessible, even about complex topics without being simplistic. So given that, you may disagree with that background, but roughly that's how I read it. And please correct that from your own perspective. But so given they may be certain considerations, how do you typically approach writing about a thinker in an essay format? How does that happen? How does the process go?
I'm not sure there is a typically. I mean, one dimension of this, of course, is where you're asked to write for. So the choice of the topic or the book you may be using as a peg is not your choice, it's commissioning editor's choice. And then you have some sense of the level and pitch of the journal that you're being asked to write for. I think in terms of getting going on the writing of it, in my case, it's nearly always that I am in some way hooked or engaged by something about some figure's writing, and I spend some time tinkering with that and thinking about that. And then that tends to drive me outwards to thinking about the role they were playing, the relation they had with the audience they were addressing, their sense of identity and so on. And that tends to lead you to want to read up more on the biographical and sociological elements of it. You start to put together something that's more like a portrait of what someone was doing. But as I say, I think the starting point nearly always is something about their writing. And you could write, if you were writing in a literary critical journal, you could possibly write a more narrowly focused piece of analysis of their actual prose. It's nearly always prose, sometimes poetry. But usually, especially if you're writing for one of the periodicals of general culture like the LRB or TLS, the focus is not quite so purely or sparely literary critical. It's asking for a bit more information to be given to the reader, a bit more situating to be done, and so then you work that in. And you know, I suppose you're aiming to be able to construct a persuasive portrait, which is also an engaging and instructive thing to read, and is in some sense faithful to, illuminating of the figure or the books that you're writing about. That's a very, very abstract way to describe it, because that's what most of the occasions have in common, but each occasion is so different that, you know, to write about any one of those, the genesis of any one essay, I think would show lots of serendipitous things or different levels of my own prior knowledge. You know, sometimes I'm asked to write about things where I know a lot about it and maybe have written about something nearby a bit beforehand. Other times, sometimes asked to write about things you don't know so much about, and you do a lot of reading, try and bring yourself up to speed. But I think the thing you touched on at the beginning is also important. I mean, I think a good critical essay in one of the cultural periodicals is very different from, let's say, an introductory text for students, as well as it's very different from a purely scholarly monograph for other experts. And it is addressed in those sorts of cases to a very intelligent and very knowledgeable, but non-specialist readership. And I think the big sin would be to talk down to such a readership, to condescend to them, to explain things that don't need explaining. So there is a certain art. I mean, who knows, I wouldn't say I always get it right, or anyone always gets it right, but I think ideally there is a certain art in alluding to and bringing in things that people will know or partly know or feel flattered that they've been reminded of, without expounding it in great detail. And again, I think that comes into the writing. You're conscious of trying to hit a certain register, which is going to seem sufficiently new and interesting to the reader without just, as it were, preaching to them or teaching them in some didactic way. You're just helping them to form a view of something by marshalling a fair bit of material for that purpose. And I think that it's not a conscious calculation the whole time. I mean, that's, of course, as with most writing, it's going on without one being aware of it. But that plays a large part, I think, in shaping the prose of an essay in a publication like that.
Well, yeah, that was a much better answer to a pretty poor question. So thanks for that, because my question was a little bit too general. I knew the minute I asked it, so thank you for that. And what was interesting about your answer, there's a number of interesting things, but that you start with the text. The text, it's kind of inside out. You start with the way the writer writes, the timbre, the tone, the style of their writing, and then you work from that to the person or the events or whatever. And that, in a way, kind of reconfirms your interest fundamentally in English, as opposed to even ideas. It's almost the written word. That's the core thing that interests you originally, and then you find your way outside of that.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I think you're right when you said kind of working from inside out. And maybe I should have said, when talking about moving to the English faculty in Cambridge, I think one of the things that I found very congenial was the emphasis on so-called practical criticism, close reading of a particular passage, and kind of pulling apart the texture of the prose or poetry. And you're right. I think that is, in my case, usually what fires me and sends me in search of the other things. And even if I look back, even when I, in the earlier work, was writing about pieces of political argument, which perhaps look more purely propositional than most of the literary stuff I've more recently written about. Even then, I suspect, I mean, I haven't gone back and looked at this, maybe you've looked at it more recently than I have, but even then, I think there's signs that it's an engagement with the language that they're using and the kind of perspective that that's representing is already in some way driving me on, even when I'm doing my best to look like a pinstriped historian of political thought and talking about the explicit propositions. There's this other level of responsiveness to the language, which is already sort of peeking through.
Yes, I mean, it's one of those discussions that can easily fall into a kind of a cliche, the style is the man, or the style is what's called a certain man in the generic sense.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the questions I did want to say is, like, have you come across writers whose style you really admired, and then you fan out, and then you find, oh, I don't really like this person. They weren't very nice, and so the style doesn't give you any indication of the actual virtue of the person or whether they even lived an interesting life.
Well, I mean, there are quite a few figures who, on more extended acquaintance, you have reservations about. I'm not sure, though, it shows that the style isn't at the same time part of who they really are. I mean, a good example I mentioned earlier, it's not the best, probably not the best answer to your question, but just because the name comes to mind. T.S. Eliot. I mean, I've done a lot of work, close work on Eliot's early critical essays, and then some work on a lot of his other later writing. Now, there are quite a few things to be found rather dislikable about Eliot, I think, and about some of his convictions, especially later in his career. But even once you've registered all that, I still think that that kind of spikily counter-suggestible intelligence, which was at work so dazzlingly in those early critical essays, is also part of him. I mean, in some ways it's bound up with and gets overlaid by the more religious elements, slightly more reactionary elements, more respectable elements, really. It becomes more of a suited figure. But it never quite goes away, as probably in any of us, these things never quite go away. Our writing voice changes, but there are some constants. And so there would be a case where, I could have read a lot of the early essays, the Sacred Wood and the selected essays and so on, and thought, oh, here's a very interesting, congenial, attractive voice. And then the more I read, I thought, do I really want to be in the company of this man? I expect there are more telling examples to be found than that. I mean, taking people I don't know at all as well, from everything I've read biographically, I can't imagine I'd particularly wanted to spend a lot of time with Nietzsche. But, Nietzsche as a writer, Nietzsche's aphorisms are just irresistibly attractive and engaging. So I think we often live with a certain, discordance between some of the things about the person humanly that we might not be very drawn to, and some of the things about their style and their writing which we're very drawn to.
Okay, well, thank you for that. If we change gear a little bit now and move away from essays and actually move to what you call a monograph, Absent Minds, which came out in the early noughties. We're moving now into the 21st century. I mean, I'd maybe like to start more negatively on that book. For me, it took on a number of preconceptions and myths about intellectual life in Britain, or the English intellectual. So maybe if we start with that before we ask you about more constructive stuff you were trying to do in that book. So what did you think were the key, most important myths you wanted to lance in that book?
Yeah, I'm not sure the negative and the positive can be very easily disentangled here, especially with a book with such a strong sort of revisionist urge at its heart. Well, in an obvious way, what I call in the book the tradition of denial, the claim that in Britain, usually it really meant England, but often people said Britain, there had been no such thing as real intellectuals, and real intellectuals were either found elsewhere in other countries, a prime example, France, or found in the past. We used to have them, but now they've died out. But nobody is ever willing to say that we have intellectuals at the moment. And this, as I tried to show in that book, is a very, very long-running and widely ramifying claim and set of claims that cluster around it. And so I was partly trying to explore how the very category of the intellectual had come to develop, and the uses of the word show that it's quite a, if you're not careful, quite a mishmash of different ideas, so that no one sentence containing the word intellectuals is going to necessarily be talking about the same subject as another sentence containing the word intellectuals, because they vary so much in their reference. And wanting to show that, as I would have thought from one sense is obvious, there's just as varied and rich a tradition of intellectual life and of intellectuals in Britain as in other comparable modern societies. I tried to go about that not by writing a single narrative, and this possibly goes back a little bit to what you were saying about that book, that Noble Science of Politics. Absent Minds deliberately took a series of different slices. I mean, there's a whole section which is comparative studies on other countries. There's a section on repetition and the long-running nature of certain themes or topics. There's a section on the development of the word and the concept and the analysis of that and so on. So these don't stack up as one straight sequence. They're different approaches to the topic. And the book was complained about when it came out because it, well, mainly it was complained about because it didn't include the reviewer's favorite intellectual. So how could you write this book without talking about X or Y? And the point was, it wasn't meant to be a survey of who were the most important intellectuals, and it wasn't a gallery of individuals. It was meant to be an analysis of a problem, the question of intellectuals in Britain. Why is that? How has that problem come to occupy so much cultural space, and how can we, in some sense, disaggregate it and think about it a bit more intelligently? So I have a few some chapters on one or two selected individuals which reveal something about a kind of, as I think, a kind of unsteadiness in their self-understanding as intellectuals, which is very symptomatic of this tradition that I'm talking about. But I don't attempt to provide portraits of the leading intellectuals or make any judgments about who the leading intellectuals are. So the book is more revisionist, and if you want to call that negative, it is more negative in that sense than a lot of other things I've written. But that's perhaps partly just because the longer I worked on it, the more I felt that there were such deeply entrenched assumptions here that unless you went kind of root and branch for understanding the way this term had been used, you were just going to end up repeating some of the same cliches as everybody else.
I mean, with certain books, I mean, a negative lesson, a negative insight is enough. You don't have to necessarily point to something more constructive, which may not be there anyway. You're demolishing a preconception. But was that really your, well, not just your prime, but your only motive? Or were you saying, well, no, I want to get rid of this preconception to open up another vista, which I think is there, but is being clouded by this prejudice that, you know, Britain is not, has no intellectuals or is peculiarly anti-intellectual?
Well, I did want to get rid of the idea that Britain was peculiarly anti-intellectual. You find, of course, that most countries, when you look closely, think that theirs is the one that's peculiarly anti-intellectual. There's a great tendency to see virtue being elsewhere. And I think in that sense, yes, I wanted to say that the emphasis on a kind of British exceptionalism here is misplaced. It's, I mean, each country is exceptional in some sense, but also France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Britain. These are all historically important medium-sized Western European cultures which have a certain number of things in common. And there are local traditions about how to talk about intellectuals which differ in those countries, of course. And the whole question of the somewhat mythologized status of intellectual in France would be the chief example of that. But it's not as though England was somehow total exception and then all the others had the real thing and England uniquely didn't. That did seem to me a silly claim in itself and a bit of a larger kind of mythologizing of English exceptionalism. So to that extent, yes, I wanted to attack that as well. Okay.
I mean, just before we leave this particular topic, maybe if we just bring it to a more comparative level, because during I think the 80s and 90s, you did spend sabbatical years in Paris, so you probably got a greater sense there of, you know, what the role and nature and status of an intellectual in France, 80s, 90s, and so on. And as we know, stereotypically, France is the home of the intellectual in the way that stereotypically, wrongly or mythologically, England isn't. So did you find your time in France, that myth being challenged, or did you challenge that, or did you say, no, it isn't necessarily the home of the intellectual? And also, do you think that has changed much, though, between the 80s and even now?
Mm. Well, really, I was there to educate myself about French intellectual and cultural life and history. I spent quite a lot of time. I mean, I did do a lot of work on French late 19th and 20th century intellectual history, which I never really used in any publication. But that was because I was trying to get my education up from very low to just about passable. I mean, it would be silly for anyone to ignore the role of the mythology of the French intellectual in itself. That is an important part of French culture. And it remains so. You can still see allusions to it in Le Monde or something today. It doesn't mean, of course, that what is portrayed in that mythology is actually the historical reality. There is a distinctive story there, especially going back to the Dreyfus affair and the role of those very centralized Parisian educational institutions and so on. But broadly, the role of writers and academics and so on in France does not correspond to that rather mythologized model. I mean, you normally can only get a few seconds into this topic before somebody mentions the name of Jean-Paul Sartre. He's taken to be somehow the embodiment of this, the incarnation of French spirit, something unthinkable in Britain and so on. Well, of course, it was nearly unthinkable in France. I mean, it's a very unusual figure and never duplicated as such. But I was interested more in the if you like, the kind of sociology of intellectual life, and especially the role of, as I said, those very centralized Parisian educational institutions, L'École Normale and so on, and their hold over French academic life. As it happens, for 20 years, my wife was a professor in one of the Paris universities. And so I was able to see some of the academic culture quite close up. And it is not suffused with Sartrean big name intellectuals by any means at all. It's would be more recognizable to somebody employed in a British university as a university department. I'm not very well informed about how far this has changed, the tail end of your question there, because I did all this work in the 80s and 90s, and Absent Minds was published in 2006. And I suppose then I let my interest, tail off rather after that. So I think I'm not very well informed. But at the period at which I was starting to learn about this in the mid-1980s, I think we have to remember we were still just at the end of that great dominant period of leftism in French intellectual life. It was the Mitterrand government had come in and also in a way met its nemesis in the form of modern capitalism. And the Communist Party was still a player in French politics and French intellectual life. And the whole question of whether you had been Marxist or anti-Marxist, Stalinist or anti-Stalinist, which had so divided French intellectual life between 1945 and the 1970s, that, or at least the echoes of that, were still very present at the beginning. It looked much more familiar as the history from earlier in the 20th century. I think ever since then, it's gone very far away from that. Those elements are not now central to French identity. The kind of liberal revisionism that was starting up in the 1980s has become much more dominant, and that's really changed the historical story. But that's a later phase of the story than the one I was then working on.
I mean, one thing that struck me about when you try to compare, say, British and French intellectual life, and you mentioned that the École Normale and is if you were, would you be better placed if you were in France or Britain in terms of a meritocracy, intellectual meritocracy? Which is the one that's easier to move up the ranks on if you're just based with an intellectual meritocracy and not on privilege or class? which one is the better one to be in? And part of me thinks it might be France, but again, you feel that you could be just getting into the mythology there. And yet it seems to be an important question.
Yeah, well, meritocracy is often an illusion in itself, isn't it? I mean, the more closely studies are done of the social advantages of those who do make it through these respective systems, the more you see how background matters. And of course, France was the home of the classic study of this by Bourdieu and Passeron, showing the enormous importance of cultural capital in getting into the elite institutions. And in France, they're even more, I think, ruthlessly selective and centralized than in Britain. And if you don't get into one of the great secondary schools that prepares you for the agrégation and all of that, then you're really not going to make it. And those are fiercely selective. So in both cases, in Britain, there's the whole story of the scholarship boy. It was a boy initially, mostly. And I suppose even people like me and in my generation, we were, still in some ways illustrations of a diluted version of that, though with advantages that I've mentioned in terms of schooling. In France, similarly, there's the boursier, the scholarship holder who gets to go to one of the great Parisian lycées from a poor provincial background and then does exceptionally well academically and becomes a professor at the Sorbonne and so on. Yes, there are those stories in both cases. But I have to say, I think in both countries, and possibly, sadly, increasingly in both countries in the last couple of decades, family background and cultural and material advantages seem to count for more rather than less in making progress through those systems.
Yes, I think you're definitely right about that, and the evidence suggests that as well. Well, that actually brings us nicely to the kind of last, kind of closing kind of section I'd like to ask you about, Stefan, and that's, two of your big preoccupations in the last 20 years seem to be, third level education in Britain, and the nature and status and fortunes of the humanities. Now, there are two very big areas, but maybe if we just kick off with the universities, and if I can ask you, what is it primarily about the status, the current fortunes of universities that most preoccupies you?
Well, of course, a lot of what I've written has been in the last couple of decades, but I did start writing about this in the mid-1980s. And the constant, perhaps, is that it was because in that period we started to see the imposition, I think, of some misguided assessment systems for research assessment, discussions of the use of bibliometry in measuring scholarly value, and in general, the imposition of sets of managerial and bureaucratic measures and criteria, which seemed ignorant of, or in some cases rather unsympathetic to, the academic culture they're trying to measure and to improve. So from that quite early stage, I was interested in pushing back against that. Sometimes, of course, these other aspects of my interest we've talked about come in. I mean, the language of official publications on some of these topics is horrendous and shows a complete kind of cloth ear as far as understanding what goes on in universities is concerned. And also, of course, I've been interested in the history of universities because being interested in the history of intellectual figures and intellectual life of the country, a lot of which comes from universities. So I think that had been there for a long time, and an increasing irritation with some of the media and political discussion of universities. And then there was a particular crisis, I think, in the years 2010, 2012, the Tory-led coalition government started to impose a new funding system, broadly speaking, student fees rather than public funding. And it did seem to me at the time, and actually I still think I was right about this, it did seem to me at the time that most people, including most people in universities, were not alert to the importance of this change, how fundamental these changes were, and how far-reaching their consequences would be. The whole attempt to turn students into consumers and academics into service providers and universities into competing commercial entities and so on. And so I wrote some quite agitated things in those years, really trying to draw attention to this and to expose what seemed to me the misguided premises of it. Competition will drive up quality and all these other mantras from the business schools. And for a number of years, between about 2010 and 2017 or so, I paid very close attention to public policy on this, read all the white papers and so on, and wrote quite a lot about it. I should say, it was never that I particularly thought that, my little voice would have any effect on government policy. It was more that I thought it was important to alert a wider readership, especially people in universities, to the consequences and the implications of what was going on. And also, I think something quite important is really to just to help to bolster the morale and self-belief of people in universities, to say we don't have to accept this third-rate language as being an accurate account of what we do. Hold on to some fundamental truths about that, even if we're having some unsympathetic policies imposed on us. So it was in part an attempt to not to kind of invent some new position about universities or understanding of universities, but to state effectively for our time, in our circumstances, some of the things which I think actually most people in universities intuitively or unreflectively had taken for granted up till that point and were now being introduced. So that's really what stirred that writing. And for some years, I went around giving an awful lot of talks about it and so on, and really didn't do a lot else. I decided then when I retired that I should pull back from that. I think partly as a retired figure, you're in danger of losing a bit of credibility if you're no longer in the trenches, as it were. And maybe I'd said my say, maybe I would only repeat myself. So I've done less of it subsequently.
I mean, one of the things that does surprise me about this development and the kind of the growing defensiveness that's happening around universities and the sort of values that used to inform the university, their existence and what they were trying to do, is the relative silence and the lack of protest from the actual quarter itself. I mean, there are not many voices like yours stating, not the obvious, but stating what needs to be stated. And that it is quite of a mystery to me. What's going on? Are academics just not very brave? Are they just not very perceptive? What do you think is going on here?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there are different groups involved, aren't there? So one thing I think is academics do tend to be very absorbed in their research and teaching. And as long as they feel they can get on with that, they may see that there are some very unsympathetic measures being adopted around them, but they probably will let those go by and hope tomorrow they can still do their research and teaching. I think there's that element in it. I think one should have sympathy for younger academics who are often in precarious or slightly vulnerable positions professionally. And I think they are sometimes a bit cautious, understandably cautious, about speaking out against certain things. One of the things that has, well, depressed or alarmed me and certainly intrigued me when I've gone around to some universities and preached my kind of sermon, is one or two people would come up to me afterwards and say, in all seriousness, well, we completely agree with what you say, and then they sort of look around you, we wouldn't dare say it here. Now, I don't know if that's paranoia on their part, whether they're exaggerating, or indeed whether in some universities there is such a heavy managerial hand that they do feel they have to be careful about what they say. But if it's anything like the latter, that's extremely discouraging, I must say. So in some of those cases, I think there are understandable reasons. I mean, I actually would be a little more severe on vice chancellors and other academic leaders. I mean, it's a completely unenviable job, I recognize, being a vice chancellor of a modern university, and you have a great many different kind of considerations to balance, of course. But nonetheless, I think, especially around about 2009, 2010, when there was clear discussion of what should happen next, universities really could have taken, university leaders really could have taken the lead in saying no to certain things. Similarly, when certain kinds of assessment were introduced in the 1980s, I think particularly if the stronger universities had stood out against it, so they couldn't be accused of protective self-interest, because they're actually always going to do very well out of the assessment system. But if, Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial and UCL and other big university leaders said, no, this is the wrong set of categories to apply. We're very willing to cooperate with government in getting some adequate form of assessment going, but this is not the right form. If they'd had the strength to say that, I think that would have probably stopped some of those measures in their tracks. So there are some people I feel some understanding for their silence or their reticence. I'm a little less forgiving, I think, of the general level of university leaderships.
It's like a loss of nerve, definitely a loss of intellectual nerve at the highest level in these universities. Who should have seen the danger signals. If we don't oppose it now, it's a slippery slope, and now the slope has proved extremely slippery.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I mean, moving now to the humanities, I mean, there's very clear connections here. You're concerned about university third level, and your interest in the humanities, as far as I could see. There's a lot of overlap in why you'd be concerned about both. So I don't think they're two separate concerns. And you've spoken and written very acutely about this and very relevantly. But maybe if I can open with a very general question, what do you think are the optimal ways of framing the point and authority of the humanities? Because you're very conscious of not being overly defensive about the humanities. If you do that, you're almost getting off on the wrong start. And I know it's a very general question, but maybe a few pointers about what's the best way to think about the humanities in a way that's not self-defensive.
Yeah, that's still a pretty unmanageable question. I'm tempted to say that if we're talking about the value of the humanities, it's pretty self-evident. I mean, we only get into these defensive gyrations because of some assumed hostile account of them as in some way irrelevant or equal or elitist or some very implausible charge of that kind. In fact, if you just start with trying to deepen and extend human understanding about matters of prime human importance, history, literature, thought, ideas, and so on, well, of course we want to do that and do it well and pursue it as far as we can take it. I mean, how could you not? What's the problem? So I'm tempted to be a bit, kind of recalcitrant about the whole argument and say, well, are you really saying you don't understand the interest of history, the appeal of literature, the need to get our thoughts about these things clearer, and to go on from there? What I, as you can tell from what I've written, what I certainly don't think we should do is get into a wrestling match with the sciences, the various cultural preconceptions that strengthen the position of the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology, and so on, mean that's always going to be a losing strategy for the humanities. And actually, I think the better people in the sciences recognize that. They recognize that there's a common goal here. This is the university as a whole. This is intellectual inquiry as a broad body, not one team against another team. I think that's always a mistake. But I think it's also a mistake to try to rephrase the supposed benefits of the humanities in terms which you think are going to appeal to an economically minded set of people in either business or in government, so that we get an awful lot of calculation about how, as a result of people studying English and going into the creative industries, 83 billion is added to the economy every year or something like that. Of course, you can see why, given the way public discourse is often conducted, you can see why that's people attempt to do something like that. But that doesn't actually tell you anything about the value of the humanities, really. I mean, that's what that tells you is about a byproduct at best. And even then, it's an estimate, but a byproduct of the value of the humanities. I've sometimes thought it's like saying that the value of learning to play the Beethoven piano sonatas is it makes you a better typist. Well, it may, but only to people who think that being a typist is more important than playing Beethoven. Is that going to be an argument for doing it? And I don't think we have to start from there. So, as you could implied in your question, and I'm really going to accentuate this, I'm very unwilling to play the game, I think, of so-called justification of the humanities. I'm not willing to separate out the humanities to begin with for most purposes. I think that's a strategic mistake. And I'm not willing to be defensive about how we'll define it and its value in some other terms either. So, I tend to stand pat.
Yes, good. Because I think, this is where history can sometimes help us, and where, certain wrong routes were taken, because it's so easy to fall into the trap of the two cultures. And then you have this false dichotomy between the sciences and the humanities, and it's not a dichotomy you want to create. And it's a false one if it's a way of considering that's a good way of defending the humanities. But one thing that struck me particularly in some of your essays on how to think about the humanities and how to defend them is this nice parallel you say about, well, what's the point of trying to live a good life? If someone questions you about, well, how do you want to live a good life? We still think it's good to live a good life. And they sound, and it's also good to do the humanities. And if someone sort of says to you, well, why do you want to live a good life? They shouldn't have, that question shouldn't be coming up. And yet it doesn't come up about the good life, but it does come up about the humanities, as if there has to be another justification beyond the obvious one. So I think that came out quite nicely. You kind of tend to finish on that sometimes in some of your essays, what more are you looking for here?
Yeah. Well, that's right. I agree. I think we're both saying much the same thing about that. I mean, of course, it comes up for the humanities in part because the context is often the question of public funding. The good life has not yet been made an object of any particular ministry, so it doesn't come up in that form. But once you get into those sorts of questions, then of course you very quickly get driven in a broadly a kind of cost-benefit analysis direction. But as I say, that's not really the most interesting way in which to reflect on the character of the humanities.
No. Although I do feel there's a malaise that is kind of pervasive, that is quite predominant, for example, in the commercial world. Well, we deal with the facts, not the values. And that can contaminate all sorts of other debates where values is much more important than the so-called facts. And even our agnosticism about whether or not there's such a thing as a good life, or one life being better than another. We're very, very coy about those sort of questions because we're afraid to be seen as dogmatic or authoritarian. So all sorts of false labels attached to these objectively valuable discussion points.
Yeah.
And the humanities seems to just get thrown in on that in the way that the sciences don't.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think behind the economic or pseudo-economic arguments, there does often lie the kind of relativism that you point to. So the idea is that if you somehow can let the financial measure stand as a proxy, let it be a kind of metric, then you don't have to even address the question of what things are valuable in themselves. You kind of duck that. You just say, how much does this generate in finance, and how does that compare to how much something else generates in finance, and just leave it at that. And I think that, as you say, that's a very, very pervasive kind of mindset, and essentially a kind of relativism, and underlies, or part of what underlies, the now, obsessive pursuit of metrics, of trying to find some quantitative representative against, so that two things can be compared in one immediately numerically identified as superior to the other because the number is higher, when in the first place the metrics that have been assigned are arbitrary or ill-grounded and don't capture the value at all.
Yes, exactly. I mean, a good instance of that is, for example, students now are asked to indicate whether or not they think their lecturer is any good. And all you get out of that is a kind of an aggregate of preferences.
Mm.
And should those preferences determine the value of education, especially at third level, but at any level really, and yet that because it's measurable, well then we're going to use it.
Yep.
Because and that's the route we've gone down now, unfortunately. And it's so obviously false and destructive.
Well, obvious to you and to me, but perhaps not to everybody.
Oh, well. Okay, well, I'm going to begin to close down now the interview. Stefan, I'll close it up. But maybe just before I do, are we any future books coming out of you that you can give us a preview about, or that you can indicate what's coming next?
Yeah, well, so what most recently, I've been doing some editing, actually. I brought out with Helen Tavantiran, my colleague, the edition of Empson's Structure of Complex Words, big scholarly edition that is, of an interesting book, I think, and worth doing. And then at a different level, I did the Oxford World's Classics edition of Orwell's essays. Different sort of literary challenge, but again, I think something I found quite worth doing. Not because I'm necessarily such a fan of Orwell. So the introduction had to tread a fine line between recommending him, much to recommend, and alerting the reader to some of his more bullying plain man tactics, where I think there's much to be alerted to. So those are both now done. 20 odd years ago, I got into a very long exchange with Francis Mulhern in the pages of New Left Review about, broadly speaking, cultural criticism, series of pieces by each of us. At the time, Verso raised the question of doing a book of it, and I was not very enthusiastic, and I'm glad to say it died. But then more recently, Francis wrote another installment, in a sense, and addressing a lot of my more recent work. And Verso got in touch and said they would like actually now to go ahead with a book bringing all these pieces together, and would I write a new piece to conclude the exchange, or anyway, conclude it for now. So I've done that, and that's now in press and will come out next year with the rather grand title, I think, not my choice, What is Cultural Criticism? But anyway, some very good pieces by Francis Mulhern in it, and then replies by me. And then long term, I've been working on a big history of English studies as an academic discipline in Britain, from, well, whenever we think the beginnings are, which are much argued about feature to begin with, but I go back as far as Scottish rhetoric and belles lettres in the late 18th century, and studies of philology and literary history and so on in the mid-19th century, and bring it up to the early 1960s, which for various reasons is a kind of natural terminus for the account. It's a very institutional account. It's unlike anything I've done before. I spent a lot of time learning about degrees and departments and so on, to try and give a fairly thickly evidenced account of the development of it as a discipline, because we haven't got one, and what we have got is some, I think, rather tendentious short claims about its character, its salvationist or ideological character, which in my view are not really borne out by the history. So I spent a lot of time on that, and it's nearly finished, and so I imagine in, I don't know, 18 months or so that might come out. All of that has kept me busy recently.
Yeah. Is that a single volume? The final?
Yes, okay. It is a single volume. It's at the moment, unless Oxford University Press, who are going to publish it, veto it, it's going to be a very fat volume. So maybe there'll be some cutting before we get to the final stage. But there seems to be an awful lot of history to cover.
Well, you have been keeping yourself busy. Well, I'd like to end, Stefan, if you don't mind, on a kind of a desert island note, and ask you, if you did find yourself on an island like that, desert island, what book, piece of music, and luxury you bring with you?
Yeah, well, I think you have to answer this question in a desert island disc spirit, don't you?
Yes.
I think that's quite right. Well, so on the book, I'm going to cheat and say I want to have the Oxford English Dictionary. It's partly cheating because it's multi-volumed, but I want the whole big thing, and I want it in print. I'm hoping my desert island won't have a good Wi-Fi connection, so I'm not have to bother with anything on the internet. But I can look at the infinite riches of the OED to keep me amused. Musically, I find it hard. I suppose, like a lot of people, my musical tastes have got probably drier and earlier, more classical rather than romantic and lush as they started out when I was a teenager. So I've been tossing up in my mind whether it should be the Bach unaccompanied cello suites or Beethoven string quartets. But if the game requires me to have one, so I think I would go for Beethoven string quartets. Perhaps I'd go for the 3 Razumovsky quartets as my single choice. And my luxury would be a good pair of running shoes, so that on my desert island, I can still get my fix. I don't know how people do keep themselves sane on a desert island, but in my ordinary or so-called ordinary life, going running is a very important way of helping to keep myself sane-ish. So I would not want to be deprived of that. So that would be my luxury.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you very much, Stefan. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's been a real education for me as well, just like reading your books.
Thank you very much, Johnny. I've certainly very much enjoyed it. And of course, I will have lots of second and third thoughts as answers to your questions long after we've finished this recording. you.